it's funny how this webinar started. We started on .NET, and then we kind of quickly thought about, well, what are front-end people doing? And what started as potentially a .NET webinar turned into this React front-end webinar, which is actually really interesting. Especially it all kind of started from that blog post that's available on the Syncfusion blog, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I think that's where you and I really wanted to chat about those kind of things. So should I start by doing an overview of kind of React and what hooks are and kind of what they aim to accomplish for a lot of folks?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Khalid, go ahead and step in and just a little bit about context API and all that. That's a great idea.
Okay. I'll start with a little slideshow here that I kind of whipped up for our folks joining us today. This is just a slight overview. You're not going to become an expert after this, but you should know some of the high-level things. And before I start the slideshow, I want you to keep a couple of things in mind. The big parts of what makes React are really two things, in my opinion. First, it's very component-driven design. And when we get to Chad's kind of code demo, you'll see how components can kind of interact with each other. The other big thing about React is really its unidirectional data flow. And what I mean by that is typically when state changes, React will go back to the top of the component tree and check whether each component needs to be re-rendered or not based on that state change. So keep those things in mind as I kind of go through. I see there's a lot of beginners, maybe intermediate folks getting started with React. And you're probably wondering, you hear this word hook a lot. What is a hook? So looking through the documentation on the React site, I really came up with two definitions. Both are pretty clear and kind of aligned to each other. But the first way is really the most important. It's a way to separate state and other React features without the need to write a JavaScript class. So historically, before version 16.8 of React, and I think we're up to 18 now, you had to write components by extending a base React class. And I'll show you a sample of that here in the next slide. Additionally, hooks are special functions that let you hook, and that's why they're called hooks. They let you hook into the React lifecycle features. And you'll also see some of these special lifecycle methods in the old way of writing React components. So here's kind of the old way. This is still supported, by the way. So if you're inheriting a React code base, you're likely to see components written this way. You first start with a JavaScript class that extends React.component. And from there, you get some lifecycle methods. So the constructor passes in the props or the state of that component initially. And then you use the this keyword to set the internal state of the component. You also have access to these lifecycle methods. In this example, I have component did mount. So this lets you kind of execute any code after the component has kind of been rendered. And then finally, the most important, arguably the most important method in the lifecycle of a component is the render. Here's where you kind of create your HTML through JSX, and you can do things like figure out what the display is going to look like and hook into events like on click, on change, or any other kind of UI things. So what I want you to take away from this in particular, you'll notice that the state is really tied to the component itself. So we're using the keyword this, not state, to set the internal state of our component. When we convert this component over to using hooks, the first obvious thing that most people notice is like, wow, that's a lot smaller for one, right? You can see here, this is probably like 15 to 20 lines of code, and here, very, very minuscule in comparison. The other thing you'll notice, we're not using a class, we're actually using functions here. So a function gets called. We also import the hook, the state hook in this case. And when you deconstruct a state hook, you get two essentially values. One is the value of our state, and the other is kind of a mutation function that allows you to change state over time. And from here, you can just use those hooks in your JSX like declaration, right? So down here, you can see we're going to display count, and on click, we call the mutation method to increment the count as well. So again, think of that unidirectional data flow that happens in React. We call this method, and then React kind of goes back up the component tree to kind of re-render our components. Chad, do you have any questions up this point, or good?
I think you're doing a great job. I am just wrapped.
All right. If you folks have any questions, feel free to ask them, but I'll keep trying to get through this so we can get to the code demo, because Chad did a great job, by the way, so I'm excited to watch that. So a lot of folks may be dealing with older React code bases versus kind of trying to migrate to hooks. You should always ask yourself as a good developer, why are we doing it this way, right? Like, what problems are we trying to solve as developers by taking this particular approach? So as you may have noticed in the refactoring to using hooks, state is no longer tied directly to the component. You can declare a state hook internally to a component, but you can also pass it in via props. And I think that kind of separates the state versus kind of the display of that state in a component. You can also notice that a function is a lot simpler to understand than, say, a class component. So the complexity gets reduced by a ton, right? And if you've worked in any code base, as the code base grows, you want to keep complexity down so you don't kind of get confused as to what's doing, what where. I think that's really important. You can also use more of React's lifecycle features without classes. And you'll see this in a later slide, some of the out-of-the-box hooks that comes with newer versions of React. You can do a lot without having to kind of deal with classes in that sense. And this last one is kind of an inside baseball thing from the React team, but as they were trying to enhance some of the React development flow with things like hot reload and minification and tree shaking of your React applications, they just found classes kind of got in the way of that. So they're just trying to make the development experience better for you, and then they found classes just kind of got in the way of that. So like I said, there's benefits. It's a lot easier to test because now you're dealing with functions. You're not dealing with classes that you have to instantiate, call the constructor, and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot less code. You saw that between the two examples. And as you'll see in Chad's example, one of the things that can kind of happen in a React application, especially when you're not using hooks, is this idea of higher order components, which can potentially or lead into something that folks deem as wrapper hell. Did I spell minification wrong? My bad. Sorry, Rick. So yeah, the things you want to avoid is wrapper hell. And just to kind of explain that from a high level perspective, when you're not using hooks, people typically created higher level components so that that higher order component could manage state in the child components. And sometimes you'd have to pass each state object down into those, child components as well. So that's where prop drilling comes from. You'll likely hear that term a lot if you're dealing with any kind of component-based system like React or some of the other ones out there. Okay. Some of the hooks included with React include the state one, which we'll see today. The effect hook, which comes not from like a laser show. Let me see. Do I have reactions turned on? Yeah, it's not those kind of effects. We're not talking about those kind of effects. We're talking about side effects, right? So whenever you change the DOM, that's considered a side effect. That's something that's not managed within React's lifecycle. So they give you this effect hook to be able to do those kind of things. We'll also see the context hook today, which is in Chad's demo, which is going to be super cool. And we have the callback hook, which kind of lets you memo-wise functions that could potentially be reused across kind of these lifecycle events. So there's a lot more hooks, and most importantly, you can always write your own hook as well. So here's some basic rules when you're using React hooks. Call hooks from React function components like we saw. That's really important. You can also call hooks from within other hooks because they're within the React lifecycle. That's super important. What you don't want to do is you don't want to use hooks outside of React in, say, regular JavaScript, because that's just not going to work for you. Again, and finally, think of React's unidirectional data flow. You want to make sure hooks are instantiated deterministically. And what I mean by that is, don't instantiate your hooks inside of a loop or an if statement or a nested function that may or may not be called, because then that's not going to consistently create and manage that state for you within React. So if your application's acting funny, just double check that, and that's typically a problem a lot of people do in React. Like make sure you declare all your hooks right at the top of the function and not in any kind of branching logic there. So, and I think that's it for me. That's kind of like a really quick overview. I see people enjoyed the light show, so
Do the light show again. It was cool.
I could do other ones. Look, I even have balloons here. So
Yeah. It's your birthday.
I pulled out all the stops. So yeah, Chad, let's switch over to your computer and let's look at some demos.
Sure. Absolutely. And so before we switch over, well, let me go ahead and do that now. All right, so I'm showing up here that blog post that was referenced earlier. And this is kind of where we got the genesis for doing this whole webinar today.
Mm-hmm.
And Khalid mentioned a couple times that my sample was very cool. Don't believe it.
I think it's cool.
I spent 7 years as a C# developer, Windows Forms at ASP.NET, and I actually thought I could write cool apps. Then I met some designers, and I realized I really can't. So here is my attempt at making a cool app to kind of show this context API and how it works. Yeah, so cool is a relative term. I know that. But the idea here is we're going to create a context provider as some top level function. Yeah. And then all the children here are going to, well, a lot of children here don't have any idea that the data exists until you get to the components that actually do it. And because they are all talking, they're all using the same context. If I make any changes, it gets reflected immediately into all the other controls. And let's add something else here.
Hey, who doesn't love peaches? That's good stuff.
Exactly. But because we're all talking to the same data context, it shows up immediately. And this is just React doing its own re-rendering of all the functions.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, whether it's right or not, this reminds me a little bit of iNotify in the C#, where database changes, that data object tells everybody else that it changed. That's kind of the same concept that's going on here with this.
Yeah, I think we'll see that once we dive into the code. But like the big things that are happening in this code example is we're using the state hook to create kind of this collection of fruit that's used throughout our component hierarchy, and we're using the context hook so that certain components can reach into kind of the global shared state and use that collection of fruit, right? So we talked about prop drilling and this kind of wrapper hell. Chad, in your example, we can see how components can maybe cascade and have children components just with kind of like your borders that you've created there, right?
Yeah, the little borders are just to show you the parent-child relationship, and they're all nested into some tree.
Yeah, so let's jump into the code and kind of show folks like kind of what's happening here.
So this is the beginning, and yes, this is you're welcome. This is good till the 14th of November, the license key. But this is the beginning of the app here, and you saw the main app text, and I'm just calling two different functions at this point. So a simple thing is, and I'm using WebStorm, by the way, as I write this. I thought it'd be cool to try out WebStorm, see how it goes. But this is just some dead end component. I'm not really doing anything here in the function. Here in the app, I'm actually creating my fruit context provider. This is the bit that everybody's going to look for. So if we go back to here, the grid component needs the context, right? And it's going to look at its parent, and then at this parent, and then at this parent, and then it's finally going to find the context provider. So these guys here are going to do the same thing, but they just make one step up until they find it. Both the fruit basket and the chart component. Because the fruit basket is here, and then the chart component's here, and the other ones, this right here is the first parent of the other components.
That's a really good point, Chad. Like reading the documentation on the context hooks, it's really important that the context that you're accessing is up in the tree and not, say, declared at the same level of that component. Like it's really important that that context is like above it, right? A lot of people make that mistake when using these context hooks.
So, and I actually did that. I was playing around with this just to see how it worked, and I tried putting the context, the fruit context provider, in each of the component modules, the grid, the chart, and the fruit basket. And what I got was 3 distinct sets of data. So they each made their own little worlds, and they wouldn't talk to each other. So we need to have this at the top, and then our controls here. This is the command to go and look for the fruit context provider. And then it just goes up, up, up until it finds it. And it'll use the first one it finds. So if you happen to put another fruit context in here, then it's going to find this one. And then the chart's going to find this one, and they're not going to talk to each other. So we need to have one central app, one central component or function that has this data object or data provider. And then once you get down the whole list, here is the Syncfusion grid where we're doing the editing, just showing data this way. A couple things we're doing in here. We have, this is the event that's actually going to do the edit or update to the data set. And this event is fired. And this event is fired on every time a cell is, you step out of a cell, then the action event is fired. So that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, it's cool to see Syncfusion controls kind of be able to be fit into the React component model. And you can see like grid component still fits within that component driven model. I'm seeing a lot of folks ask, like, can you think of the context? Is it comparable to session variables? Also someone says it sounds more like the viewback in MVC. I would say it's probably closer to that idea. It's like, it's really the word context kind of gives it away. It's like, it's a shared context that you can choose to use or you can choose to ignore. And I think you folks can see in Chad's example, it's like this grid one component chooses to use the context and pull it out from like that component tree, but we also have other components that completely ignore it, right?
Exactly. And that's one of the beauty of it. You can have a component nested 3 or 4 steps down. Maybe you have it in a form and then in a tab and then in a menu, or however you set it up. You may have it nested several ways down. And these intermediary functions, they don't have to have any concept of that data.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need to pass it through. They don't need to do any of that.
Yeah. Rick says, which would be cool for isolated editing? I guess so, right? Like when we're designing components, we want to make them as kind of like as encapsulated as possible so that we can reshare those components, not maybe just across our one application, but potentially across our organization. If you're doing open source, you want to make sure that other teams and other developers can use your components. It kind of comes like Chad and I, you and I were having this conversation, like, what do you think some of the benefits of using context are, and maybe what are some of the drawbacks for using the context hook?
So I think the benefit is, again, in my mind, it works like iNotify.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else is going to share the same data set. You don't have to code that up at all. Just create the data contexts and you're off and running. Mm-hmm. And then stay in that same tree. Probably one of the downside is keeping track and making sure everything is in the proper tree. So you have to find some master and make sure everything you have flows out of that master, and then you don't have any other context somewhere that something could pick up by mistake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Muhammad is asking, so if we're using the same component in different tree of components, do I understand that the context is different in that case? So just to clarify how the context hook works, from the component, and in this case, chart 1, what happens is from that component, we go up the component tree, and it uses the first instance of that, say in this case, fruit context. So you can actually have multiple contexts, but the first one that is found is typically used. So, yeah.
So exactly, and just to kind of show it in my app, the chart's going to use the fruit context, and the fruit context is created here. The dot provider, this is the context that it's looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just going to go up the tree. So we're here now. We're going to go up and look at each parent until it finds the fruit context provider.
Yep. And
that's kind of what it does, which is very simple to let everybody share the same context. But you have to keep track, because you may need, for some reason, you may create a context here. And if you name them the same, then this guy's going to stop here, and he's not going to go all the way to the top.
Yep, exactly. I could tell there's a lot of .NET people in chat, because people are dropping MVC, WPF, like all this stuff. So that's great.
Model, yes, it is. It's putting all those concepts have come into React. Mm-hmm. The idea that you have one data connection, for example, mm-hmm. or one data context, or one view model that you're going to use for every control, and you just have to reach out and grab it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, when it comes to the context hook, I think a really good example that a lot of folks, especially me, I can wrap my head around, why would I want to use this, when you're talking about UI and UX, there are user settings that probably need to be shared across your application, but you don't want to define it as a prop on every single component. A good example of this is like themes, right? So whether you're team dark mode or team light mode, you don't want to set the theme on every single component, especially if you're building out a UI library that's specific to your application. That's kind of the good part of using kind of these context hooks. Carl says, I feel alone on Next.js. I'm sorry, Carl. I'm sorry, buddy. But a drawback though too is if you're on a UI team and you want to create components that are shared across multiple organizations, or maybe you have an open source project, you may want to consider lightly using the context hook so that your consumers don't have to constantly think about creating those providers all the time. That can make consuming your components a little difficult. But the drawback obviously becomes now your components might have like more properties than you typically would have just using the context API or the context hooks. So, yeah.
And Abhinav, I think Zigo answered your question, but yes, you can put as many providers here as you wish. Well, actually, that's not it. This is it. Yeah, this is it. You can put as many providers, you can create as many providers as you wish. I only have one data set. So I only have one. I can only make one. But yeah, you can make as many as you like.
Very cool. It's is there anything else interesting kind of in the code sample? Maybe folks want to see kind of how we create the data set. So we have fruitbasket.js over there. What does that look like?
So this is actually that little UI component. This is just going to scroll. It's going to get the context, and it's just going to parse it out and put it in a list. Is all it's doing.
And
that's
I guess
that's this guy here. Yeah.
Where are we getting this data from, though? I think that's kind of an important thing for folks to see as well.
So we have the data. Data is defined here. It's a huge data set. So I really had to be concerned about performance in this sample. And here's the actual fruit context. This is what the context is. And that's all it is.
Yep. So Adriano is asking, so the suggestion is not to use useState for grids and use context in order that if the UI is re-rendered, it doesn't affect the useState. So just to be clear, so the context hook is really just creating a shared environment or object that can be used throughout kind of like hierarchy. But in this case, the fruits that you can see on line 13, WebStorm is really helpful, and it puts a little hook icon there to show you when a hook's being instantiated on line 13. But
that's cute.
The fruits collection is still using the state hook. So you can see we're using useState on line 13 and passing it that array of fruits. And then on line 17 into the context provider, we push both the value from our state hook and that mutation method, the set fruits val as well. So they're not really, the state hook and the context hook are not really competing as they're not competing for either or, they're actually being used in combination here. So, yeah.
So the context hook is just getting the data connection, and the state hook is doing your edit or delete.
Yeah. And so in the case of, if you want a shared repository of data so that, your state is consistent, a good example example to think of as like shopping cart, right? You added an item from a button within like a card, right? A card has an add to cart button. You click that button, but now you want the shopping cart icon in the top right of your screen to reflect, that you've added an item. So,
for example, here I'm adding some new item, and this is my shopping cart down here, the fruit basket. Then once I update this, nice. All right. So I did something. Yeah, now we'll see if we can figure out what it was I did.
it's probably in the grid. It's probably in the grid section. But this is what happens, Chad, when you go off script. The demo gods punish you.
Yes, it is. Murphy is here. Yes. Yeah. That wasn't changed.
Yeah, but Mansour says useState component data storing. It's not so much storing as much as it's declaring an instance of a state object, right? And then the context is for making data visible to all the hierarchy wrap within that context provider tag. So that's accurate. So I think folks are getting kind of how these hooks can kind of work together. I think your update method. Oh no, there it goes. Works.
See, it works. I can write code occasionally.
So yeah, I think kind of like that's an overview of hooks. Is there anything else in the demo that you'd like folks to kind of know about or understand when it comes to React hooks?
So I think this demo there'll be a link to this GitHub repository whenever we post the video. There'll be a link to this GitHub. You can come get it if you like, just to see how it was put together. And I think we've covered. I think the context hooks are really cool. They make it, again, otherwise you'll be passing the same data set through every single component into the bottom component, and that can become tedious.
Yeah, especially. So go ahead. Sorry.
No, just saying this is a really cool thing, and I'm glad I found it in React.
Yeah, if folks want to see more, they definitely should go check out the blog post on Syncfusion. So I guess Adriana's asking again. Sorry, me again. Don't apologize. We're here for you. About the error that happens. Sometimes I'm not yet understand if it's correct to update the use state or pass a new variable to data source. So whenever you declare a state hook, you're going to get two variables, right? One that is the current state of your hook, and then the other is a method to essentially mutate that state. So in our case, like we're just pushing a new item onto the array via that set fruits value, right? So that's kind of what's happening. And since we're using the same methods that were declared with the context hook, it's still the same instance, right? So that instance of the fruits array is being used by other components. The way the React lifecycle works, like everyone just gets that update when the tree is re-rendered. So hopefully that clarifies that. I'm seeing more .NET stuff, Blazor. So yeah, I have thoughts about Blazor, but maybe that's another webinar.
That's definitely another webinar. Yes, so there's a lot of thoughts about Blazor.
Yeah. On that note, yeah, this sample will be available, I guess, on GitHub. Chad, do you have any closing thoughts?
I've been asked about where do we declare the data format for the context. And I think that's just pulled in from the data set itself. We're not specifically stating the format, are we?
Yeah, you can actually create any type of object. So in this case, if you look at line 17, this is really shorthand JSON notation. We're creating a JSON object that has both instances of our hook variables, so the value and the sets fruits val. So we're just creating a JSON object. You can basically put any kind of object you want in there and any kind of data that you like. There's no strict structure for what kind of objects would go into the context. So,
yeah. And then for the Syncfusion at the grid level, we're going to pull out whatever the data, whatever type of data that comes from us is what we'll display in our grid.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to define the data types. The grid's smart enough to figure that out for the most part.
Yeah, Rick wants to talk Blazor offline. If you folks want to chat, I'm on Mastodon. You can find me there. I also have a blog. You can definitely go there and read some stuff and see if you can find my socials on there to contact me. So happy to carry on conversations and talk .NET, talk JavaScript, talk React with anything every day. So, yeah. On that note, Chad, I think we're good. I think this is hopefully folks enjoyed this. Give me a thumbs up if you liked it. I won't do any effects. I promise. No more effects from my side. So yeah.
All right. Well, yeah. Thanks everybody for joining. We appreciate it, and have a good day.
Bye everybody.
Bye.